I'm Laura Bonnell, and this is the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast coming to you from Detroit. Please subscribe and even rate and comment on our podcasts when it moves you. I learn something new with every podcast, and I'm always inspired by the people that are showcased here. We don't give medical advice. You need to connect with your doctor for that. I hope that this Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast educates you and sparks some volunteering or advocacy. The CF community needs people like you. Thanks to our sponsor, Viatris, for their support. Cambrey Vasconez White is the mother to toddler Rowland, who has cystic fibrosis. And if you heard a previous podcast with Vicky Maldonado and heard her struggle finding an equitable approach to rare mutations in the United States and Canada, well, these two women connected. And as you'll hear, it's because their sons share the same mutation, and they were shocked. Rowland got access to an off-label CF modulator after a battle with her insurance company, and we'll explain what off-label means. It doesn't mean that it's not Trikafta. It actually is Trikafta. What it means was that her son's mutations actually were not on the approved list for Trikafta according to the FDA. We'll get into that in depth throughout this podcast. There is a huge story to tell here, and I am sure that it is going to help other parents who have children with a rare disease. But first, a little bit about Cambrey. She attended the University of California, Irvine, for her bachelor's degree in psychology and social behavior, and Loyola Marymount University for her master's in school counseling. And she became interested in advocating for those living with rare cystic fibrosis variants after her son had a false negative newborn screening due to the rare CF variant, one which has only been found in Ecuadorian populations. And she currently sits on the Newborn Screening Steering Committee, the Clinical Review Committee, and is the community co-chair of the Health Equity Team Science Award for the CF Foundation. And you can find Cambrey taking dance class, training for a triathlon, or going on an outdoor adventure with her son. So just a wonderful person that you're going to hear from right now. Cambrey, thanks for joining us on this podcast. I'm so glad to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
I am excited to tell your story. It's really important to make everyone aware of a lot of the hurdles that you've gone through since Rowland was diagnosed. First of all, tell us how he's doing now, how old he is, and then we'll kind of go on your journey.
Yeah, so Rowland is 2.5. He'll be 3 in June, and he is doing really well. So we actually got access to Trikafta back in August, and we'll talk a little bit about it later, but his 2 mutations are not eligible for Trikafta in the States. So we did get it off-label. It was a surprise to us, but I think that has really helped him. And he's doing really well, aside from illnesses, because he's in preschool. Yeah, he's doing well. He's fun and active and outgoing. It's been great.
So while we're talking about this, first tell us how he was diagnosed, how you figured out he had cystic fibrosis.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story. Before Rowland was born, so we have a family history of cystic fibrosis on my husband's side of the family. His cousin has CF. And so because of that, when I got pregnant, we wanted to do a CF carrier screening. This was during the pandemic. And at the time, I lived on the island of Hawaii. And so the OB that I saw, I had shared it with her that we have a history of CF on my husband's side of the family. And she said, great, like we're going to take a carrier test. If it's negative, no need to test your husband. So she did it. It was negative. Didn't think about it again. Rowland was born, very normal pregnancy. He was 8 pounds, 2 ounces at birth. And yeah, everything felt very normal. I'm a first-time mom. This is my first baby and everything seemed good. I was breastfeeding. It came pretty easily for me. And then at 2 months is when we started to notice some problems. At 2 months, I noticed that he started screaming while I was breastfeeding. And he would stop short and just start screaming in pain. And I didn't know what that meant, but I did notice that there is a downturn in his weight. So When he was born, he was in the 40th percentile for weight. And then at 2 months, he went down to 15th percentile. So I was obviously concerned because he's falling off of his growth curve. So I spoke to the pediatrician and she was like, oh, no, you're good. Like 15%. Yeah, like it's a little low, but like I'm not worried. So I was like, okay, I'm worried, but we'll just go with it. And at 3 months, he went down to the 3rd percentile. And at that point, I was very concerned. But, I reached out to Facebook. I reached out to my friends. I was trying to find out someone who had a similar situation. And everyone kind of was like, you know what? Like sometimes they have their own curve, like kind of just trying to reassure me that everything was fine. But I was super worried. And so basically I went to the pediatrician and I said, hey, I want you to refer me to a pediatric gastroenterologist. And she was okay with it at that point because 3% is a little bit concerning, but she wasn't as concerned as I was. So we went to the pediatric gastroenterologist and she said, okay, yeah, like he has gone down and we definitely want to bring up his weight, but he is still gaining weight. So that's good. And so she provided some intervention. She suspected silent reflux. She put him on omeprazole. I ended up having to stop breastfeeding and I moved to pumping. And then we would put extra like formula into his breast milk. We thought maybe it was a dairy allergy, all these different things. And the interventions were working, but not to the degree the GI wanted them to work. And so I think around 4 months, we were still very concerned. So we kind of just wanted to rule everything out. And so we were like, well, can we do blood work, stools? Can we do a sweat test? We know what a sweat test is. We have a family history of CF. We know what CF is. And she was like, well, like, I don't like to do sweat tests till about 6 months. His newborn screen was negative, right? And we're like, yeah, it was negative. And your carrier screening was negative. And I was like, yeah, I was negative. And she's like, yeah, so I'm not like super concerned because he is gaining weight. And most of the people I see with cystic fibrosis are not gaining weight and they're in the hospital. That's not the case. So like, I really don't think that's what this is. So we're like, okay, we'll hold off, whatever. We're continuing to try to get him to gain weight. And finally, around 6 months, I was like, no, we need the sweat test. Like, I just want to rule it out. And well, actually what happened was I was feeling really anxious before the holidays. So she said, okay, fine, let's do all these tests now just to rule everything out before the holidays. And I was like, okay, yeah. So we did the blood work, the stool samples, and the sweat test. And I remember like they told us, oh, you'll get your results in 24 hours. And we didn't get the results back. And my husband, I wasn't worried at all. I was like, oh, the tests were negative. And my husband was like, we haven't gotten the results back. And I'm feeling worried. And I was like, oh, well, let me call. So I call the clinic that we went through to do the sweat test. And I was like, hey, just wanted to get, my son's results back. And she goes, oh, they're locked. And that's when I knew that he has CF. I was like, we need to unlock them. And they were like, oh, I don't know if we can do that. I was like, I deserve to know my son's results. You're going to unlock the results. And to be fair, we had an appointment later that day. So I understand why they locked them. They wanted to have a sit-down conversation, but I just couldn't wait. And so then that was when she said, his results are indicative of cystic fibrosis. I think the sweat chloride level was like 76 on one arm and 74 on the other. And then I just lost it. I was really angry. That was just a long-winded version of how we got the diagnosis. And then from there, I learned all about the reasons why we had a false negative carrier in newborn screening.
Well, tell me why they didn't detect yours. And by the way, that wasn't a long story. That was a really concise explanation. So it didn't feel long at all. Thanks for. And it's important to know. It's important to know all the things you went through and dismissed until you didn't, right? But what happened when they said that, you weren't a carrier and how was that missed?
Okay, so once we got the results, I was really angry. And the first thing I wanted was answers. I was thinking like, how could these things be missed? And it felt like a very lonely place to be. I was just shocked. I don't know. I was shocked. So this is where I started looking for answers. I don't even remember seeing the newborn screening results. As a postpartum mom, you're not really thinking about your child's newborn screening results.
Right. But newborn screening is, I'm saying, when they tested you.
Oh, for the carrier screening.
For the carrier screening. Sorry. Yeah, because newborn screening, I get that. I get how they missed it. But we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But how did they miss you for being a carrier?
Yeah. So it's a similar thing. They use a panel to check the mom for particular genetic mutations. And so they checked me. And what I learned later was that it was I believe, 23 mutation panel. And most of those variants are only found in white populations. And I am part Ecuadorian. My dad is Ecuadorian. And so that particular CF mutation was not on the panel. And it's really ironic because we're living on the island of Hawaii, which is the most diverse state in the country, yet they're following a 23 cystic fibrosis mutation panel that's mostly white population. So I just find it a little ironic. But yeah, that's basically what happened with the carrier screenings.
As we're all learning so much more, which I cannot believe either, how much is being missed because of where our panels are. Like in Michigan, we test for 60 of 2,000, but it's costly. So that's the reason. In other states, it could be 4 that they're testing out of 2,000 in newborn screening. So everyone isn't being tested. But and then you asked questions, just continuing your journey here. You asked questions about newborn screening as well?
Yeah. So then I started asking questions about that. So I was kind of like, once I found out the diagnosis, I was kind of like figuring out both. Like, I need to find my carrier screen. I need to find this newborn screen. And I need to figure out why this was missed twice. And so I just shared with you kind of what I found out with carrier screening. So for newborn screening, it was similar. It's a little more complex. So states have different protocols for newborn screening. And so I'm in the state of California. And basically, their first step in the newborn screening process is to check the IRT level, or the immunoreactive trypsinogen. And typically, that number is high in babies who have cystic fibrosis. And if it's triggered, they'll then go to that next step of identifying CF variants. So my son's immunoreactive trypsinogen was 324, and the normal in California is like 69 or less. So it was super high, like very, very high. And there's different states that would have caught that. There's certain states that have like a very high IRT flag where they would have just immediately gone to a sweat test. So yeah, so he would have been caught in other states. But because California doesn't have that very high IRT like red flag, they just do the next step in the process, which is, okay, the IRT is high. Let's see if we can identify any cystic fibrosis variant. And so they went to that next step and nothing was identified. And so it was negative. If California would have identified one variant, what they would have done next is try to identify a second variant by DNA sequencing. But because there are 0 variants identified, it was considered negative. It's so odd because, we're talking about improving newborn screening. I'm on the newborn screening steering committee. California has like one of the better newborn screens in the country. They test 77 variants. The nurse that I talked to from the regional center said that they had expanded their newborn screening panel 2 weeks before my son was born to include some variants from Mexican populations.
Wow.
But I'm not Mexican, I'm Ecuadorian.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just kind of crazy.
That is crazy. And it's because you and your husband were so on it that Rowland was diagnosed at 6 months, because that is so early. There are, as you know, we know people who are a person of color who are 26 years old or 54 years old and were late diagnosed. And that puts their health back so far. Yep. And they're so behind, and they're usually not very healthy and trying to catch up. If you can tell us, too, what your challenges are now, because Rowland has rare mutations, and that's a whole nother challenge for you.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to speak on that first part. Yeah, we're really, really thankful we got a diagnosis at 6 months. And I think that is a combination of where we live. We have access to a really good CF clinic, kind of just us being very persistent as well. And also, yeah, I guess those two things. I honestly don't think we'd have a diagnosis if we still lived in Hawaii.
Wow.
I really don't. And also, I would say that we're lucky because my son is pancreatic sufficient. So aside from nebulizer treatments, we really didn't miss anything medically necessary. So I do feel very thankful.
And let me ask you, because I've talked to other people that live in Hawaii. As a matter of fact, I talked to a father who thought he had to move to the mainland because unless, I believe, and you might know the answer to this, unless you're in the military, there's a military hospital that can help for CF, but there aren't any clinics or nothing related to cystic fibrosis there.
Nope. It makes me so angry. We actually own a home in Hawaii. Our plan was to move back. The only reason we moved to California was because our family's here, but we love Hawaii and we've always wanted to move back, but we can't move back. I guess we could. There's no clinics there. We'd have to fly back to California every 3 months. And we're not military, so we don't have access to that one clinic that exists on Oahu. Also, we were living on the Big Island, so.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's some work to be done in Hawaii.
Yes, there is, yeah.
And continue on about the rare mutation and the challenges that is for you.
Yeah. So again, I think I'm so thankful that we have access to Trikafta. So thankful. I think I was really shocked that we got access. However, I can share the challenges that we've had going up to Trikafta and then kind of the challenges going forward. So my son has 2 rare mutations. And actually, I just listened to Vicky's podcast, which is so good. I mean, so Vicky and our sons have the same 2 rare mutations. It's insane. Like, I cannot believe that we met. I met her 2 months after the diagnosis. She's been such a huge support. I don't know what I would do without her.
And that's the beauty of this community.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but that is the beauty. I mean, and the serendipitousness that happens to all of us all the time in the CF community. It's crazy.
Yeah.
How you get connected.
Yeah. So because Rowland has 2 rare CF mutations, neither of those mutations are on the FDA approved eligibility list in the States. And he has 1 mutation that's considered class 1. And then his other mutation, H609R, this is the one I carry. They don't know exactly what class it is. They think it's class 2 or 3. But essentially, they believe that that's the result of him being pancreatic sufficient. It does have some residual function in it. Because of that, there's reason to believe that it could respond to Trikafta. And I remember at that first appointment, our genetic counselor is the most amazing person. And she's just well connected. And she didn't know anything about this mutation, but she went and she checked all of her connections. And then she looked into the literature and she found this research article out of Sick Kids in Toronto that basically showed that H609R does respond to Trikafta in vitro or in the lab. And she gave it to me and she's like, okay, this is just one thing. Take it with a grain of salt, but this is very hopeful for you. And then she also mentioned that there is this study. It was a serotyping study out of Ohio. And we ended up having Rowland in the serotyping study, which basically what they do is they do a little swab of the nose, kind of like a COVID test. Mm-hmm. And they send it over to this lab in Ohio who will grow the cells in the lab to be tested against the different modulators, including Trikafta, that are available on the market. And if that reaches a particular threshold, you can use that for data to the insurance company. And so we did that process. And actually, while there was a bump in Trikafta, it wasn't enough to reach the threshold that we would put it in an appeal for the insurance company. So that was really heartbreaking for me because I thought that was it. I thought, well, that's it. We're not getting access. But then once we talked to our CF team and I talked to a couple other people just outside of that, they all were like, no, there was still a bump. You got to try to get him on it to see how he responds. So that's when we decided, in conjunction with our cystic fibrosis clinic, okay, we're going to try to prescribe it when Rowland turns 2. So we did. It was automatically denied, which we knew because his 2 mutations aren't eligible. And so what we did was, well, what our genetic counselor did is she wrote a letter that basically explained why we believe that this is a medically necessary treatment for my son. So we included a couple of things. We included that Sick Kids article. There is a case study in New York of a boy who's homozygous for H609R, meaning he has 2 of the same mutation, and they got him on Kalydeco, and he's doing fantastic on Kalydeco. So we actually put that in as well. And they had to go to court to get access to this. But it set a precedent for us. So because they went to court and they published it in a journal, that helps my son. So we put that in the literature. And then also, my son was hospitalized for pancreatitis when he was 1. Pancreatitis for a 1-year-old is super rare, even in CS. It was very scary. His lipase levels were out of just so high. Amylase levels were so high. And kind of the working theory from our GI was that it's a possibility that eventually he's going to go insufficient, because some people are insufficient with H609R. It's kind of like an in between type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so they ended up writing in the letter that they believe that Trikafta could save my son's pancreas because he still is sufficient. And if we can help boost his function a little bit, hopefully he'll stay sufficient forever. And so they put that in the article or in the appeal letter as well. So we honestly, I thought I was going to be denied again, and our insurance approved it. And I felt so much relief. I was not expecting an approval. We have great insurance as well, which is a privilege that we have that I don't take for granted. But yeah, so we're lucky, but it is a little bit of a unique way that we got to him being on Trikafta, but he's on it at a very young age, and I don't take that for granted. I know it's a new medication, and there's people that have been waiting their entire lives to get on it. And there's people that don't have access in other countries, including Vicky, whose son has the same 2 mutations as my son. It's unacceptable, I think.
And she's in Canada, for anybody that didn't listen to the last podcast. But it's crazy.
But I do believe it's working. So Rowland is mostly GI. And when he was 1, he used to vomit at night constantly, like just 4 or 5 times of vomiting. One time we had to go to the ER because he was vomiting blood. Just terrible, terrible GI issues. And he's always had high lipase and amylase levels, and that's a sign of your pancreas not functioning properly. So kind of what we think it was that he was functioning enough to be sufficient, but not functioning like a normal pancreas, which is why it was so inflamed. But after Trikafta, we did 3 months. So I was very intentional about this. I did blood work the day before we started Trikafta, and then we had to do our 3-month blood work afterward. And so he's always had high liver levels too. And so that was really scary.
Mm-hmm.
His liver levels went down on Trikafta, which I know can happen, but is kind of unusual.
Yeah.
But what really I thought was crazy is his amylase levels have been triple since birth. They are now normal levels. And there's nothing else we changed other than Trikafta. This is all anecdotal, right? Because this hasn't been studied, but he has rare mutations. But I truly believe that's Trikafta. And he has not vomited at night like that since Trikafta. And it's kind of an odd, most people, it's different, right? But Rowland's different. He has 2 rare mutations. And I really believe it's Trikafta. And it's been such a relief. But going forward, because we're off label, we're always going to have to, well, I guess everyone does. Everyone has to resubmit, but I think there's just a little bit more fear that they would deny it. So hopefully we'll just continue to honor it and continue to approve it. And then we also have to pay a lot of money for it because we can't get copay assistance or anything because it's off label.
But when you say off label, you're on Trikafta. So
you're on Trikafta. Yeah. It's considered off label because it's not approved for his 2 mutations.
Oh, I see. Because
off label, yeah.
So that's what okay.
Or at least that's the lingo I've heard, and I've just kind of repeated.
Okay.
I can't say I know for sure, but yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you cannot get any assistance.
No.
Even though it's working.
Yeah. Well, so our insurance is covering most of it, but we still have to pay the copay. And the copay is expensive because the drugs are expensive. But
the drugs worth every penny, which we know, and we're a small disease of 40,000 people in the U.S. So it's worth it, of course.
Yes.
But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm just thinking like so much is going through my head right now. From this, what do you hope to bring to other people who are dealing with either an ultra rare or rare mutation like your son, where this is a challenge? I mean, from Vicky's experience in Canada that she doesn't have an answer yet. She's still working on that because their system is a little different.
Yeah. Well, I think what I really want to make clear is that these two mutations still aren't eligible in the States either. There's just this other path that we can take in the States with insurance that's not possible in Canada, or it's a different process.
But I also wonder, I'm sure there are other people like you that have been denied by different insurance companies.
Yes.
Or didn't maybe give the same information that you had. So I can speak to that too. So I guess the other thing that I wanted to kind of point out is that I think there's this misconception that if you have two mutations that aren't on the FDA approved eligibility list, that it means you don't respond to Trikafta. And that's not always true. So if you have two class 1 mutations, that means that there is unfortunately no protein to rescue. So Trikafta won't respond. And, gene therapies, we have to continue talking about that because we don't want to leave anybody behind. However, there's an even smaller set of people like my son who have maybe one class 1 mutation and then another mutation that could potentially respond to Trikafta. But because it's a rare or ultra rare mutation, it's maybe not as well studied in the literature, or maybe it responds, but not to the threshold that needs to be considered FDA approved. But that doesn't mean it doesn't translate to clinical benefit. It does. And that's very clear with my son. And even the boy in New York, he's on a modulator. He's clearly responding to also. And so I guess I just want people to know, like, if you have at least one mutation that isn't class 1, definitely look into that further. Talk with your team, ask to talk with your genetic counselor, and ask them to show literature in the research about your mutation and have them explain what exists. And it's hard because it's very complex and difficult. And I am not a scientist. This has just been from my own research, but I do have a very limited background in research. So it's hard, but I don't know. I guess I just want people to know, like, it is still possible to potentially get on a modulator, but it just takes extra digging. And again, I want to be clear. I'm not a doctor. I'm not I don't know. I don't want to say. I hear you, but I also would say that moms are scientists. I just feel like, I know we're not doctors, but you and your husband diagnosed your son. Yeah. You made it all work. You got connection. You got the insurance to cover it. I mean, I think we're a little bit of everything. Sure, we don't have the doctor in front of our names, but we're part of the team, and a really important part of the team. And just think of all the stuff we didn't know before the diagnosis. We didn't know half of the words or the lingo or the information. I mean, all the stuff we've been talking about already today, that you've learned in 2.5 years. It's a lot. So don't discount your value is what I'm saying.
I think I think I'm someone who's very persistent, and my background is school counseling, which it's an advocacy role. So I'm very into advocacy just in general. But I will say we're just very lucky that we have access to a genetic counselor that she is informed so much of kind of what I've learned and where to look for information. So we're so lucky.
That is wonderful. And do you feel like you're able to make people more aware? Are you hearing from people that were in a similar situation, just like you and Vicky?
So I've definitely connected with people on social media. I think everyone has a little bit of a different experience, but I mean, honestly, I do know people who have mutations that aren't currently approved, and they're working towards getting access to Trikafta. So I'm part of like different Facebook groups and stuff. So I've seen people who have wanted access, but they can't get it. Because it's not just the letter. It depends on the insurance. Like it depends on so many things. It's not like we're really lucky we got access, but it's more challenging than I think people. It's just really challenging. And everyone has like kind of a little bit of a different situation because all the rare mutations are a little bit different. But yeah, I have connected with people that are in similar situations.
I was wondering, did you reach out to the GPS program at Vertex? Because I wondered if, because it's covered by the insurance, I wondered if they would help you, or is that not possible?
So I never ended up reaching out to them, and I probably should have, but it was because our clinic told us. So our particular clinic is one of the more diverse clinics in the country. And as a result, they told me that instead, I think it's like about 10% of people don't have access to modulators. Our particular clinic is 25%.
Wow.
So they are very aware of kind of what we have access to and what we don't. And so the nurse coordinator told me that because it's off label, they won't approve it. So I never actually myself went and checked for the extra assistance. And in retrospect, I probably should have. I just had like a lot going on. And honestly, like, yes, it's expensive. We're really lucky we can still afford it. And so I just decided, you know what? It's fine. We're just going to do it. We're done. We paid for it.
I'm going to find out, and we'll have the answer in show notes because I am curious. I'm curious about that. What have you found from doctors? Are they like behind you and supporting you, and are they aware?
Yeah. So I am so grateful for our CF clinic because I just feel 100% supported by them. Again, I just feel really lucky. I don't think we would have had this, obviously, in Hawaii. There's no CF clinics. But again, I think it's the genetic counselor at our clinic. I mean, she's the one who knew about, she theorized before we even got the mutations back that it was probably from my Ecuadorian side. Like she already had a theory and she was right. And I just think that she's been the one that has like really changed Rowland's life because we got access to Trikafta. I mean, they worked on it as a team, but I think she was the one that ultimately wrote that letter. So she's just been so impactful for us. However, the one thing that I have noticed, and I know I think I'm like hesitant sometimes to say things like this, but it's important to share, is that I have talked to people who have rare mutations and basically they ask their doctor, oh, is there a way I can get on a modulator? And the doctor has said, no, your mutations aren't eligible. So sorry, you can't get on it. And that's it. There was no further investigation. And so I have met people, multiple people, that basically their doctor kind of just stopped it there and they didn't realize like, oh, wait, I might actually have a mutation that could potentially respond. This is worth looking into further. But it's like, you're not going to know that unless your doctor or genetic counselor or whoever on your team shares that with you. The only reason we knew that was because of our genetic counselor. So I do believe that there's doctors out there who maybe, it's not that they're not equipped for their job. It's just, they're such rare mutations that people just aren't aware that there are mutations that do potentially respond, even if they're not on that FDA eligibility list. Does that make sense?
That does.
I've only ever talked about newborn screening. I've never talked about this before.
You're doing a great job. Yes, you're doing a great job. I understand why you're getting a little bit nervous about it, but you're doing a great job. And I appreciate your story and Vicky's story because it is really important to make people aware, people who are newly diagnosed. This could be a huge turnaround for someone. It's always when you hear from somebody else. Even when we diagnosed Molly, it's because there was a public service announcement that talked about Kiss Your Baby. It was called the Kiss Your Baby campaign. If they taste salty, they could have cystic fibrosis.
Wow.
That 1 30-second thing is how we diagnosed our daughter before the doctors.
Wow.
The doctors didn't even believe us. So someone's going to hear this podcast and they're going to say, oh my gosh, we didn't know. And now we're going to write letters to our insurance companies. So what you're saying is really important and important for people to hear. So, and in 2.5 short years, you've done something huge, not just for Rowland and your family, but, you have Vicky who's in the same boat, and now you're helping other families on Facebook or on, rare groups. So I think it's really important. And I just wanted to wrap it up by asking you, what are your hopes for the future for you and for others in the CF world?
Yeah, I hope for a cure. I think it's coming in this lifetime, and I hope that happens. I think I don't know. I think the 10% of people that aren't able to access a modulator because they don't respond, I think it's just so important that we continue searching for genetic therapies, because I can't imagine I know we say no one left behind, but currently they're left behind, and it probably feels terrible. And then as far as Rowland's situation, I really would like more mutations on that FDA eligibility list. I really would. I think that there are mutations that maybe don't respond to the 10% threshold that currently exists, but they do respond to a particular threshold. And we don't know what translates into clinical response, but we know if there is some sort of response, even if it doesn't meet 10%, that there is a clinical response. And I just think if there's a way we could get, if Vertex could add more mutations, rare mutations, I think they might be working on it actually, I would just be so happy, especially if it includes Rowland's mutation that does respond. And honestly, I just hope that doctors can learn, and I know doctors have a lot on their plate, but I just would love for them to learn more about people of color or people with different ancestral backgrounds. They're more likely to have rare mutations and therefore less likely to have access to a modulator, whether it's because they don't respond or because it's just not on the list. It doesn't matter. There's still a disparity in that. And so I just hope that maybe there's a little more awareness around it. Not a little more, a lot more awareness.
Right.
Yeah, you're asking some hard and good questions.
Well, you've had some great answers. And for your first podcast, I think you've done a great job. I really appreciate all your advocacy and everything you're doing. And you're really important to the young moms and the newly diagnosed moms that are coming up now. You have a different experience than what I had 29 and 26 years ago when my girls were born. And it's really important for all of us to know what's going on now, and for you to know what happened when my girls were diagnosed and how things changed. And it's just good for all of us to keep talking and keep making sure that everything keeps moving forward for our kids who have cystic fibrosis. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
The original music in this podcast is performed by Kevin Allen.
It's not complicated.
Who happens to have cystic fibrosis.
We all got our worries and fears. I know it's got you frustrated, but loving you is so alright.
This has been the Living with Cystic Fibrosis podcast. For more information and to learn more about the Bonnell Foundation, visit our website at thebonnellfoundation.org. That's the BONNELL Foundation.org.
This podcast was produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Follow our show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now.